At the western edge of the Pacific Ocean, northeast of the Mariana Islands, there is a place on the seafloor where the crust of the earth has been pulled downward by the collision of tectonic plates into a scar so deep that the tallest mountain on the surface of the planet could be placed inside it and disappear entirely beneath the water above. The Mariana Trench descends to a maximum depth of approximately 10,984 meters at a point called Challenger Deep, a depth at which the pressure of the water column above exceeds 1,090 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level, a depth at which the darkness is absolute and has been absolute for every moment of the trench's geological history, at a depth that no sunlight has ever reached and no sunlight ever will reach as long as the sun burns and the ocean exists. For most of human history, this depth was assumed to be lifeless. The logic was straightforward. Life requires energy. Energy in the ocean comes from sunlight. Sunlight cannot penetrate more than a few hundred meters of water. Therefore, the deep ocean, and most especially the Hadal zone, the zone below 6,000 meters that encompasses the deepest trenches, must be without life. A sterile pressure vessel of cold, dark water whose only inhabitants were the slow accumulation of sediment drifting down from the lit world above. This assumption was wrong in a way that required the complete reconstruction of the scientific understanding of where life can exist and on what it can subsist. A reconstruction that began with the first systematic sampling of deep-sea sediments in the 19th century, and that continues today with each new expedition to the Hadal depths, producing organisms and processes that expand the known limits of biology in directions that were not anticipated, and that, once documented, require entirely new frameworks to understand. The Mariana Trench is not a uniform feature. It is a crescent-shaped depression approximately 2,500 kilometers long and 69 kilometers wide at its broadest point. Formed where the Pacific Plate subducts beneath the Mariana Plate in one of the most geologically active regions of the ocean floor. The trench has a complex internal topography. It is not a smooth V-shaped valley, but a system of connected basins, ridges, and terraces, with Challenger Deep occupying the southernmost of the trench's three main basins. The pressure at the bottom of Challenger Deep is approximately 1,100 times atmospheric pressure, which means that every square centimeter of surface area at that depth bears approximately 1,100 kilograms of force. A physical environment so extreme that the steel hull of a submarine designed for deep diving must be engineered to precise tolerances to avoid catastrophic implosion, and that the human body, unprotected, which would be killed instantly by the compression of air spaces in the lungs and sinuses before any other mechanism had time to operate. The temperature at the bottom of Challenger Deep is approximately 1 to 4 degrees Celsius. Cold, but not freezing, because the enormous pressure suppresses the freezing point of seawater below the temperature of the water itself. The combination of absolute darkness, extreme pressure, near freezing temperature, and the scarcity of food that reaches the Hadal zone from the productive surface waters far above creates what biologists call an extreme environment, a set of conditions at the outer boundary of what life has been found to tolerate anywhere on Earth. The word extreme is used here in its technical biological sense, which is not a judgment but a description of the distance between these conditions and the conditions in which most of the planet's known biological diversity has evolved. The first evidence that the deepest trenches of the ocean were not lifeless came long before any direct sampling of Hadal depths was possible. In 1960, the bathyscaphe Trieste, piloted by Don Walsh of the United States Navy and Jacques Piccard, descended to the bottom of Challenger Deep in the first and, for decades, the only crewed descent to the deepest point on Earth. The descent took nearly 5 hours. The ascent took 3 hours and 15 minutes. The time spent on the bottom, at a depth that no human had ever reached, and that no human instrument had successfully reached before, was 20 minutes. In a spherical pressure vessel approximately 2 meters in interior diameter, with a single small porthole through which the outside could be observed. At the bottom, Walsh and Piccard reported observing what appeared to be a flatfish, an organism that resembled a flounder or sole, resting on the sediment, suggesting that vertebrate animals could survive at full Hadal pressure. The observation was disputed for years because the conditions inside the Trieste at that depth made careful biological observation difficult, and the identity of the observed organism was uncertain. It may have been a sea cucumber or a different invertebrate rather than a flatfish. But the observation established in the minds of deep-sea biologists the possibility that the Hadal zone was inhabited by organisms more complex than bacteria and sediment-dwelling microbes. The subsequent decades of sampling using weighted traps, sediment corers, and eventually ROVs and autonomous deep-sea vehicles confirmed not merely the possibility, but the extraordinary reality of Hadal life, a community of organisms as remarkable for what they tell us about the limits of biology as for their intrinsic biological interest. The dominant animals of the Hadal zone in the Mariana Trench, the organisms that any sampling expedition will encounter in large numbers, are the amphipods, a group of small crustaceans found throughout the ocean from the surface to the greatest depths. In the Hadal zone, amphipods reach extraordinary densities, congregating in the traps that deep-sea biologists deploy on the trench floor in numbers that sometimes reach thousands of individuals per trap, drawn by the organic bait inside within hours of the trap reaching the bottom. The speed with which Hadal amphipods find and aggregate at a food source on the trench floor is itself remarkable. A baited trap placed at 11 kilometers depth in the Mariana Trench begins to attract amphipods within hours, indicating that these animals are actively searching the trench floor for food sources rather than waiting passively for material to fall on them, and that the chemical signals from a food source travel through the still cold water of the trench with sufficient speed and range to reach a searching amphipod before the trap has been on the bottom for a working day. The Hadal amphipods of the Mariana Trench are not simply the same species found at shallower depths and somehow surviving in extreme conditions. They are distinct species, evolved specifically for the Hadal environment over the millions of years during which the trench has existed at its current depth, and they carry biochemical adaptations to the pressure of the deep that are among the most remarkable in the animal kingdom. Trimethylamine oxide, a compound that stabilizes proteins and cellular structures against the destabilizing effects of hydrostatic pressure, is present in the tissues of Hadal amphipods in concentrations that increase proportionally with the depth at which the species lives. As though the concentration of the compound has been calibrated by evolution to exactly the pressure experienced at the organism's typical depth range. This pressure adaptation is so precise that it can be used by researchers as a chemical depth gauge. Measuring the trimethylamine oxide concentration in an amphipod's tissues tells you with reasonable accuracy the depth at which that amphipod normally lives. Below the amphipods in the food web of the Hadal zone, and in some ways more fundamental to the functioning of the Hadal ecosystem than any other group of organisms, are the bacteria and other microorganisms that inhabit the sediment of the trench floor and the water column above it. The sediment at the bottom of Challenger Deep is extraordinarily rich in organic carbon relative to the sediment of the surrounding abyssal plain. The funnel-like geometry of the trench concentrates organic material that falls from the surface, channeling it down the sloping trench walls and accumulating it at the deepest points, where it provides a food base for the microbial communities and the larger organisms that feed on them. The concentration of organic carbon at the bottom of the Mariana Trench is 2 to 3 times higher than at equivalent abyssal depths outside the trench, a difference that has profound consequences for the richness of the Hadal biological community, and that explains why the deepest part of the ocean is, counterintuitively, biologically richer in some respects than the surrounding abyssal plain that is thousands of meters shallower. The bacteria of the Hadal sediment are not simply the same bacteria found in shallower sediments. They are piezophilic, pressure-loving organisms whose cellular machinery has been modified over evolutionary time to function optimally at the pressures of the deep trench rather than merely tolerating them. Their cell membranes contain higher proportions of unsaturated fatty acids than shallow water bacteria, a modification that maintains membrane fluidity at pressures that would rigidify the membranes of non-adapted organisms. Their enzymes are structurally modified to resist the pressure-induced changes in protein conformation that would render the enzymes of surface organisms inactive at Hadal pressures. Of these, bacteria are not surviving in the deep despite the conditions. They are thriving because of the conditions of the pressure, the cold, the darkness, and the concentration of organic material in the trench funnel have together created an environment that these organisms have evolved to occupy as fully as any organism occupies any environment. The polychaete worms found in the Hadal sediment of the Mariana Trench represent one of the more unexpected elements of the Hadal community. Unexpected not because worms in the deep ocean are surprising in themselves, but because the polychaetes found at Hadal depths are not simply smaller or more stressed versions of their shallow water relatives. Some Hadal polychaetes are unusually large relative to their shallow water equivalents, a phenomenon called deep sea gigantism that appears in multiple animal groups at abyssal and Hadal depths, and that is generally attributed to the combination of cold temperatures, which slow metabolic rates and extend individual lifespans, and the absence of the predation pressure that limits body size in more populated environments. The deep sea isopod, a crustacean related to the common woodlouse of gardens and forests, reaches lengths of 45 centimeters in the deep Pacific, producing an animal whose surface-dwelling relatives are rarely more than a centimeter long. A polychaete worm recovered from the Mariana Trench region reached a length of several centimeters, remarkable for an animal whose shallow water relatives are typically millimeter-scale organisms. The sea cucumbers, Holothurians, found in the Mariana Trench, are another example of unexpected abundance at extreme depth. Several species of holothurian have been filmed in the deepest parts of the trench, moving slowly across the sediment surface, feeding on the organic rich sediment, and apparently thriving in an environment that most of the planet's biomass could not tolerate. In some deep-sea photographs taken by ROVs in the trench, holothurians are the most visually conspicuous organisms in the frame, large, pale, and present in sufficient numbers that the trench floor in those images appears not desolate but inhabited, not empty but alive with the slow, deliberate movement of animals going about their lives at the bottom of the world. The question of whether fish, vertebrates, the most structurally complex animals, can survive at full Hadal pressures was answered in 2014 when an autonomous camera system deployed in the Mariana Trench at a depth of approximately 8,143 meters captured footage of what was identified as a snailfish belonging to the family Liparidaceae swimming actively above the trench floor. The discovery was remarkable not only because it demonstrated that vertebrates could function at a depth that was previously considered beyond the reach of fish physiology, but because the snailfish filmed appeared to be in good health, swimming actively, not struggling, not drifting in a state of pressure-induced distress, but moving with the purposeful behavior of an organism in its natural environment going about its normal activities. The snailfish is not an imposing animal by the standards of either the surface ocean or the popular imagination of what a creature capable of surviving the greatest depths on Earth ought to look like. It is small, typically 10 to 30 centimeters in length, and pale, almost translucent, with a soft gelatinous body that lacks the rigid bony structures that would be mechanically disadvantageous at extreme pressure. Its softness is not weakness, it is adaptation. A rigid skeleton would be more vulnerable to pressure-induced structural failure than the flexible, pressure-equalizing architecture of the snailfish's body, which distributes the force of the water column across its tissues rather than concentrating it on any rigid structure. And subsequent observations have found snailfish at depths exceeding 8,000 meters in multiple trenches across the Pacific, establishing the snailfish family as the deepest known vertebrates on Earth. Their adaptations involve the same trimethylamine oxide biochemistry found in the Hadal amphipods, combined with structural modifications to their cellular machinery that have been the subject of intense research interest as potential models for understanding pressure adaptation in biological systems. What the Mariana Trench ultimately demonstrates, what the amphipods and the bacteria and the polychaetes and the holothurians and the snailfish collectively demonstrate, by simply being there at the deepest point on Earth, is that life does not merely occupy the habitable portions of the planet and stop at the boundary of the hospitable. Life fills. It fills every space where the basic requirements of energy and chemistry are present, regardless of how those requirements are met or how extreme the physical conditions surrounding them. The Hadal zone is dark because no sunlight reaches it, cold because cold water sinks, under crushing pressure because 11 kilometers of water column weighs an enormous amount. And none of these things are obstacles that the life of the Hadal zone is overcoming. They are simply the conditions in which that life evolved, and which that life has made its home so completely that removing the pressure, the cold, and the darkness would kill it as surely as imposing those conditions would kill the organisms adapted to the surface. The snailfish cannot survive at sea level. The piezophilic bacteria of the Hadal sediment die when brought to surface pressure. The Hadal amphipods, removed from their 11-kilometer home and placed in a tank at the surface, decompress and die. They are not visitors to the deep. The deep is not an extreme version of somewhere more normal. The deep is their world, calibrated to their biology over millions of years of evolution in the most isolated and physically challenging environment on the surface of this planet. What the Mariana Trench demonstrates in the end is not merely that life is tenacious, though it is, or that evolution is creative, though it is. What it demonstrates is that the categories the human mind reaches for when it tries to understand life and habitat are categories built from the experience of surface organisms living in the thin habitable layer between the ocean and the sky. The deepest part of the Pacific Ocean is not the absence of the world we know. It is a different world entirely. One that has been operating, evolving, and living in the dark at the bottom of the water since long before anything on the surface knew it existed, and one that will continue long after the last human eye has looked at a photograph taken by a camera descending through the darkness toward the floor of the deepest trench on Earth. A world that does not need our attention, our wonder, or our understanding to persist, and that was complete and inhabited and alive long before the first human being stood at the edge of the ocean and looked out at the water and wondered what was underneath.